what's up? Today, I'm gonna show you a really simple process for making a baguette at home that literally anyone can make. It comes together in about 3 hours and does not require any special baking equipment. Oh, and stick around to the end because I'll show you my favorite way to eat a baguette. To get started, I'm gonna grab a medium bowl, and into that I'll measure 225 grams of warm water. Shoot for slightly less warm than bath water, I'd say 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32°C. Then I'll add in 350 grams of bread flour. Next, I'll grab a sturdy spoon and jump into the bowl and stir everything up to combine. You might notice that there's no yeast or salt in this bowl. When you combine just flour and water without those other two and let it hydrate, it's called autolyse, and it makes the dough a lot easier to stretch later on. This really comes in handy, especially when you're trying to make long, skinny pieces of bread like baguettes. When the dough's all wadded up into a shaggy mess like this, I'll stop with the stirring and switch over to the most powerful tool in the home baker's arsenal, the soaking wet hand. Into the bowl it goes, and now I'll squeeze and pinch and turn the dough until it's fully combined and there's no more dry spots. Once the dough's been massaged into a cohesive mass like this, I'll grab 10 grams of salt and then lay it down on top. Putting salt on top of the dough helps kind of dissolve it so that it can be more easily mixed into the fully hydrated dough later on, but it doesn't stop the dough from doing its autolysing thing in the process. Now I'll cover the dough with a lid and then grab a small container, and into that measure 8 grams of instant yeast and 30 grams of warm water. I'll stir those two to combine, and just like for the salt, yeast is really hard to dissolve into a dough that's already been hydrated, so this extra bit of water will help activate the yeast and hydrate it so that it can be properly incorporated into the dough. I'll let all this sit for 15 to 20 minutes. 20 minutes later, the dough is fully hydrated, the salt is starting to dissolve, and so now I'm going to finish mixing by pouring in my yeasty milkshake. Get it all in there now, and then I'll come back with the soaking wet hand one more time to get all of that combined. Adding wet stuff to flour that's already been combined with water takes a little bit of extra effort, whether you're using a mixer or doing it by hand. So this last step is probably going to take about 3 to 4 minutes of straight elbow greasing to get everything nice and homogeneous. And there we go, finished baguette dough. By the way, if you wanted to use a stand mixer instead of your hands to mix this dough, you certainly could. I'll leave full instructions for that down below in the description, but I would recommend mixing it to the exact same point as the hand mixed dough so the process in this video is still relevant. Here's the hand mixed dough for reference. Both of these are a total shaggy mess, but not for long. For now, I'm gonna let this hand mixed dough rise here on the counter for 2.5 hours total, but I'll check back in 30 minutes later. We need to get the gluten in this dough more developed, or stronger as I like to say. For that, I'll do a strength building fold. For that, I'll pull out a grip of the dough, stretching it as far as it will let me go, and then I'll fold it back over. Repeat that 4 to 5 times. Stretching and layering the dough like this lets us replace the mechanical force of a mixer. It also develops the gluten more gently, and as a result gives us a final product that's much easier to shape and has a more open crumb. I'll finish the folding here by rounding the dough into a nice taut little ball. Now the lid goes on, and I'll check back in 30 more minutes to fold this one more time. 30 minutes later, again, I'll pull it out, fold it back over 4 to 5 times, and then round it into a nice taut little ball just like before. The lid goes on, and now I'll let this ferment here on the counter for 90 more minutes. 90 minutes later, when I come back, you can see my dough has just about doubled in size, and it's gassed up pretty significantly. There's definitely some unwanted big bubbles in here though, so I'll pop those. I'll pop them, give those a pop. Next, I'll grab a half sheet tray and lay it down on my counter upside down and then top it with a piece of parchment. From there, I'll spray that parchment liberally with pan spray or olive oil. And the reason I'm using this sheet tray upside down will become clear in just a second. Stick with me. Next, I'll lightly flour my board, then my dough, and then I'll flip out my dough. This blob is roughly 600 grams, so I'll cut it in half or into 2 equal-sized 300-gram size pieces. I usually like to throw it on the scale because, symmetry feels good, but feel free to just eyeball it. Now, to get these into uniform tube-shaped baguettes, we need to pre-shape them. For that, I'll grab a chunk of dough, making sure the cut side is facing up, and then I'll degas it. From there, I'll grab the sides, pull them both out, fold them over each other, and then roll this from top to bottom so the folded seam is underneath. From there, I'll use both hands to roll this blob into a nice, tight, round ball. This pre-shaped step gives us both more strength in the final dough and a uniform starting point for the final shape. Without it, making baguettes is very difficult. Once I've got 2 pre-shaped balls, I'll line them up next to each other and then cover with my dough ball so that they can relax for 15 to 20 minutes. 15 minutes later, it's time to roll these out. For that, I'll scoot one of the dough balls aside, grab the other one, flour my board very lightly, too much will hurt, not help, and then I'll drop the dough ball down, seam side up. Now, I'll degas this one more time with my fingertips to remove any excessive bubbles, then I'll grab both sides and pull this out to stretch it into more of a rectangular shape. Once we're there, I'll start shaping by grabbing the top 20% of this dough and folding it over like this. Then, using my fingertips, I'm going to gently roll this tightly by pulling the dough towards me and pressing it back down to seal in the tension. Each time I roll it closer to me by about 1 inch. If you see any large air bubbles in there, definitely pop those. Those are going to get in the way of structural integrity. Keep on rolling and pop in as you go, and once we we get to the bottom, we should have a nice taut tube with a uniform seam underneath like this. Now to get this stretched out even more, I'm going to use my fingertips and thumbs in a triangle pattern to apply downward pressure while also keeping the seam that we just made underneath this the whole time. Each time I roll, I apply just a little bit more pressure to get the dough moved outwards. As I get closer to the ends, I apply even more pressure, and that gives me a nice taper. If we did our job right, we should have a 10 to 12 inch baguette shape with a straight seam running underneath like this. Now I'll move these shaped baguettes over to my sprayed parchment paper on the back of the sheet tray, and then I'll grab something to cover them with so they don't dry out while they proof. For that, I'm using this nifty foil pan that I got at the grocery store. It fits perfectly over a sheet tray that's been turned upside down, and it's going to serve double duty when I use it as a lid to trap steam while these baguettes are baking. If you wanted to skip this covering step, I would say just use a sheet tray not upside down and then cover the bread with another sheet tray as a lid, and when you go to bake, just don't use a cover. For now, I'll drop this very conveniently sized foil pan over my baggies and let them proof for 60 to 90 minutes while I thank the sponsor of this video, Klima. Klima is an app that offsets your carbon footprint. It uses your monthly subscription to actively fund science-based climate projects throughout the world that directly offset your own emissions. Specifically, that means funding tree planting projects, kickstarting solar power, and providing clean burning cook stoves for people around the globe. Using the app, you can also learn other ways that are simple and actionable to change your carbon footprint. For example, you can take less short-haul flights or use public transportation more often, or eat less beef if you want to eat less beef. I personally calculated my carbon footprint in about 3 minutes by entering some simple information about my lifestyle and habit. A few minutes later, I could see my carbon footprint and the actual projects that my subscription is going to be funding to offset it. That's pretty cool. Oh, and there's this tree tracker that shows how many trees have been planted in my name so far. It's only one, but I'm working on it. So to go carbon neutral with Klima, use the link in my description, use code BrianL10 at checkout to get 10 extra trees planted in your name. Again, the link is in my description. The code is BrianL10. You'll get 10 extra trees planted in your name. The Earth and I thank you for your support. Thank you, Klima, for sponsoring this video. 60 minutes later, when I check back on these baguettes, they've risen by about 50 to 60%. I know they're ready for the oven when I give them a poke, and they bounce back ever so slowly like this. I would err on the side of slightly less proofed here. Over-proofed baguettes are flabby, dense, and the crust is overly chewy. Now, to get these ready for the oven, I'm going to introduce some water. For that, I've got a standard issue Home Depot spray bottle here, but you could just use a brush and some water if you didn't have one of these. The moisture on the outside is going to delay crust formation and create a shiny, crackly, thin crust that's super satisfying to eat. Next, using a serrated knife, I'm going to score these baguettes by making a shallow slice every 1.5 inches or so. Then I'll cover these baggies with the foil pan that I used to proof them, and then load the whole thing into a 450F 230C oven to bake for 15 minutes. Again, if you don't have a foil pan, just skip it and spray on a little bit more water. 15 minutes later, I'll come back and carefully remove the foil dome. There's a bunch of steam under there though, so keep your hands at a distance until that's well released. These baguettes look great though. That extra steam really helped gelatinize the crust, and as you can see, we got some really good rise or oven spring. From here, I'm going to bake these for another 15 to 18 minutes. After 10 or so of those minutes, I'm going to come back and carefully rotate the baguettes so that the sides that are on the inside are now on the outside. That way that blonde interior can get exposed to some higher heat and take on some good color. You get a much more even crust this way, but be careful, it's super hot in there clearly. After 30 to 35 minutes of baking, it's time to pull out these baguettes. As you can see, these are well risen, super uniform, and the crust is really well baked and perfectly reddish golden brown. I always love that. This crust, in my opinion, is just spot on for what a baguette should have. It's crispy, toasty, and rustic, but thin and brittle as well. It's not going to tear up your mouth, and the creamy, soft, white interior gives way to a nutty, crunchy crust. There's about a 50-50 blend of crust to crumb, which is just perfect for a baguette. Let me know in the comments what your all-time favorite baguette experience was or is. This beginner baguette with some fresh ham on it and some butter smeared all over it, for me, was top 2 of all time, and definitely beat out some baguettes that I had in Paris. You guys, this recipe is super easy and anyone can make it, so I really hope you try it soon. Let's eat this thing.